Now let's talk about Nixon as president. Nixon had some personality traits that weren't necessarily very good. He was mean, vindictive, insecure. He was insecure about his upbringing. He wasn't an elite. He didn't go to an elite school, elite colleges. He really had to work hard to work his way up. His parents were basically middle class and not born of wealthy families. But he's also smart, shrewd, and determined. He knew what he wanted and he knew how to get it. He also was careful to um, bring in a loyal staff as president, people who were loyal to him, oftentimes just yes men. But one of the most important was uh, his main advisor, especially for State Department things like that, was Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was brilliant, brilliant man, and a very loyal to President Nixon. Now, as far as improving the possibility of his political party, the Republican Party, becoming victorious and wedging its way into and becoming successful in the South, which had been traditionally a Democratic stronghold, he decided to implement something that would later be called, or even called it at the time, the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was basically to exploit racial divisions. The Southern Democrats consisted of both black and white members. Okay, so the Democratic Party in the South was kind of an uneasy mixture of economic liberalism and Southern conservatism, very conservative, segregationists and things like that. But because by this time, the 60s especially, with Lyndon Johnson being a strong supporter of civil rights, they also drew in the black vote on the national level. So, in order to gain white support out of the South, Nixon began to challenge the more liberal aspects of the Democratic Party, like civil rights legislation, integration of schools, things like that. And while it was a long-term process, it eventually worked. Uh, and the fruits of it won't show up until probably 1980 when Reagan wins. But also Nixon had a liberal side. He had a more progressive side as well. He uh, he indexed Social Security to inflation, which basically means he made it Social Security more, or how you determine how much somebody gets paid, tied to, well, how much things cost. And so if prices go up more than normal, then Social Security payments would go up more than normal. Uh, he also increased food stamp funding. He also established during his presidency the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which basically is workplace safety. OSHA is the shorthand for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they make sure all workplaces are safe. Also, during the President Nixon's presidency, the Environmental Protection Agency was established. In 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed. So, as far as the environment, he was pretty environmentally progressive. But there were economic problems during his presidency. One thing was stagflation, which is a weird economic situation where you have inflation, which means rising prices, but a stagnant economy. Usually, inflation comes with a growing economy. It's growing too fast. But stagflation was two bad things. The economy wasn't growing and prices were going up. A lot of this had to do with the OPEC oil embargo, which the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting States, or I'm sorry, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in the Middle East. Um, a lot of those Middle East countries had come together to create kind of a cartel to kind of help determine how much oil they would produce and how much they would charge for it coming out of the Middle East. And when the United States supported uh, Israel in a war against Egypt during this time, well, the Middle Eastern states, in retaliation to the United States support, um, cut off oil. And the prices skyrocketed and it caused really an international crisis. Also, there was a lot more international competition for some of the products, especially automobiles, that had traditionally Americans had bought American automobiles, and that had driven the automobile industry and everything that goes with it by creating jobs and maintaining jobs and driving the American economy. Well, now, starting in the 70s, you start seeing Japanese cars show up in American driveways. And they're more or less expensive. They get better gas mileage, and the gas mileage was a big deal, especially during the oil embargo when the prices of gasoline skyrocketed, at least skyrocketed for the time. Also, there was increased federal budget deficits, much of that due to the Vietnam War and to Johnson's Great Society programs. Now, Vietnam under Nixon, he attempted what we would call Vietnamization, which is basically drawing out of American troops gradually and replacing them with Vietnamese troops, Vietnamese military leaders. And this is often very difficult because while the Vietnamese might not want us there, when we are there fighting though, and we're dying in their place in a lot of places. So the Vietnamization, while it was a great idea, it was difficult to put into action. But in the process of this gradual drawdown, they also expanded the air war and continued negotiations with North Vietnam as ways to end the war. They also began their incursions into Cambodia, I believe, and Laos as well, in order to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the way the North would bypass the border patrols at the demarcation zone between North and South Vietnam. They would just swing over into the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos and move their troops and supplies and things like that from the north to the south through those countries. And so we began illegally because it was not part of our the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to actually militarily infiltrate Cambodia and Laos. Also, there was as Vietnam protests began to escalate, you had some major problems. You had the Kent State tragedy where National Guard troops in Ohio actually shot and killed peaceful protesters. You had the Pentagon Papers case where a State Department or a Defense Department contract worker named I'm drawing his name. Daniel Ellsberg, found documents, secret documents that proved that the government had been lying to the public for years about the things that were going on in Vietnam, and he sent these to he stole them and sent them to the newspapers, and they were published, and it created an uproar. And then the My Lai massacre, where in their search and destroy missions, it became known that in one of those missions, a battalion, I guess it was a battalion or a unit of the army, had gone into a small Vietnamese village and basically massacred all the women and children in the village because they wouldn't tell them where the men were hiding and where the enemy was hiding. And it was kept secret for a while, but somebody that was there ended up telling it to a superior, and it creates a great political crisis for the military and for President Nixon. Now this is just a little graph that shows how the price of oil and the price of gasoline both increased quite dramatically during the OPEC oil embargo. The price of oil went from per barrel went from basically $5 to $35 a barrel in 10 years, 8 years, and then of course that leads to the increased price in gasoline. So it just shows how the impact of foreign oil and foreign oil producers and providers can impact the cost of oil and gas in the United States. Now, President Nixon also had quite a bit of success in his foreign policy. His foreign policy philosophy, I guess if you will, or his doctrine, was called détente, which means an easing of tensions. It means an easing of the strained relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. You got to remember, we're still in the Cold War, and he's trying to, kind of, you know, scale back the things that have caused the most problems, like the confrontations in Korea and now, of course, in Vietnam. And one of the ways he's going to try to bring the Soviet Union to the table and to make them a little more willing to ease the tensions is he visited communist China. He was the first American president, I believe, to visit China. And when he visited, you got to remember that communist China and the communist Soviet Union were different. They weren't really allies. They had the same, I guess, they had the same ideology and the same economic or social system, communism, but they weren't friends. So by visiting China, it showed the Soviet Union that we may end up aligning ourselves very closely as friends or allies with China, and that could be a threat to the Soviets' communist control in parts of maybe Asia or the Middle East. Um, so he goes to China. Also, he negotiates with the Soviet Union a strategic arms limitation treaty called the SALT treaties, which limited the number of nuclear weapons because we had been, having basically an arms race since the beginning of the Cold War. So this was a first good step in limiting how many nuclear weapons would be produced and stored in each nation. Uh, Kissinger, in order to solve some of the problems of the Middle East, like the embargo and the disputes between Israel and Egypt, would go from one country to the other just continuously, and it was called shuttle diplomacy, moving from one country to another, talking to the leaders, and then trying to bring them to the table. Uh, now, the peace talks with North Vietnam as a way to end the Vietnam War broke off um, during the early 1970s, and so new bombing ensued. So the U.S. began renewed bombing campaigns in North Vietnam. Uh, but by 1973, both nations were very weary. We had come to the realization that we probably couldn't win the war, and North Vietnam was tired of it as well. But they were going to continue to fight for their nationalist cause. So they reached an agreement to end the war in Vietnam in January of 1973. Now, as the election of 1972 was moving forward, Nixon, championed his foreign policy successes. He was challenged by George Wallace on his right, much more conservative person, and a southern racist candidate was in the Republican Party. But he, after an attempted assassination on him, he withdrew from the race. The Democrats put forth a guy named George McGovern, who is a very, very popular liberal anti-war candidate. He was very intelligent, but he was very, very liberal and really too liberal at that time for the mainstream. And there were some other issues that went on with McGovern, such as it came out that he had been treated by a psychiatrist at one time. But anyway, it ended up being a landslide victory for President Nixon in the election of 1972. This is a photo of Nixon and the leader of China at the time. I'm not exactly sure who that is, toasting at a dinner, which this was a big deal in the early 1970s for a U.S. president to visit communist China. This is an amazing photo of people in South Vietnam at the U.S. Embassy trying to escape South Vietnam as the U.S. leaves South Vietnam as the war ends. Many of the South Vietnamese helped the United States in their war effort against the North. And the fear was, of course, and it was going to be a reality, that many of those that were left behind that weren't able to get out, there would be retribution against them when the North eventually, which they will, the North will eventually take over the South. And there was retribution, and these people knew it, so they were as best trying to climb up onto the top of the embassy and escape in some of the last flights out by helicopter out of South Vietnam. It's an amazing photo. And then the thing that the event that really brought down Richard Nixon's presidency, and regardless of the successes that he had, this is the cloud that hangs over his presidency for most people and many historians, and that is the Watergate scandal, the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. Now, this Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., it was the Democratic headquarters, and the group that was leading up to the re-election, the committee to re-elect the president, with the unfortunate acronym of CREEP, they had heard that maybe the Democratic Party at their headquarters held some stuff in their files that might either be harmful to Nixon or harmful to McGovern. And so they decided to hire some really inept people to go in and break in to the hotel and retrieve these documents. Now, that's bad enough, but as we always know, in the long run, especially in politics, but everywhere else too, the cover-up is usually worse than the crime. If you just come clean on the crime, oftentimes there's forgiveness and all that, but it's the cover-up that can be a problem. And and then these guys that were breaking in were arrested. The local police were there, DC police, and arrested them, and started going through their pockets and going through their wallets, and they found phone numbers and lists of contacts and phone numbers, and the phone exchange, the first three digits was the White House. It was the White House exchange. And so this raised a red flag. But as the investigation started, the White House did everything they could with Nixon's knowledge to kind of cover this up. But there were two very industrious reporters at the time that worked for the Washington Post, named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who decided to dig a little deeper. And probably the most important event that happened is they had a source inside the White House who knew what was going on and was not happy about it. So secretly were feeding Woodward and Bernstein this information. And there's a great movie called All the President's Men that is a story of this whole event. And I encourage anybody to watch it. It was made back in the late 70s. So anyway, with all this going on and this information leaking out of the White House, which was really freaking out President Nixon, a special prosecutor was hired by the Justice Department to look into this. We hire special prosecutors if we have reason to believe as a nation that criminal acts have been committed by somebody in government. So a special prosecutor, and he subpoenaed the Nixon tapes, which are basically tape recordings of everything that Nixon had said in the White House, especially in the Oval Office, because that wasn't uncommon for people to record their presidents, at least, to record their conversations for historical purposes. But he refused. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes, and citing executive privilege, which is basically the right of the president to have private conversations, and by exposing those private conversations, it might harm national security. Well, the special prosecutor and the Justice Department sued to get those tapes from him, saying executive privilege does not apply to this. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the case U.S. versus Nixon, the U.S. won, and he had to turn over the tapes. And of course, most famously, those tapes were missing about 10 or 15 minutes, and nobody knows to this day what was on the erased part of those tapes. But there were indictments. I mean, once it came out and it became obvious that Nixon was involved and knew about it, and many of his immediate staff were deeply involved in it, indictments began being issued, arrests. These people were going to go on trial. Eventually, some would go to jail. And Nixon, and of course, Congress began impeachment proceedings. They were going to remove Nixon from office to impeach him because of the high crimes and misdemeanors part of the treason statute. But he had the choice to either be the first president to be impeached and convicted. There were two others that were impeached but not convicted. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Well, he would have been the second. Andrew Johnson, the president after Abraham Lincoln, but he was not convicted. But Nixon knew they had the votes in the Senate to convict him, so he could either be the first president to ever be impeached, convicted, and removed from office, or be the first president to resign from office. And he chose the latter. He chose to resign, and on August 9th, 1974, he resigned on national television. And the short-term effects were that President Ford took over as the vice president, and but the long-term effects were that it really, really shook to the core Americans' trust in their government. And people, if that was the last time, combining Vietnam with Watergate, that really was a death knell for the American people's trust in our government. Now Ford, he was an unelected president. I mean, he did not run with Nixon when he won the 1972 election. He was appointed as vice president. But the first thing he did was pardon Nixon. And of course, a pardon means you release them of all criminal charges. And this made a lot of people angry. His reasoning for it, Ford's reasoning, was that he wanted to put all this behind us and begin the healing. Others said, they should have made an example of President Nixon and, thrown the book at him. But nevertheless, that didn't happen, and he was pardoned. Also, during Ford's presidency, you do see the eventual collapse of South Vietnam and its fall to the north. Now, Ford was up for re-election up for election in 1976, and with this, the stain of Nixon and Watergate and the pardoning of Nixon, hanging over him, he was challenged by a governor from Georgia, a peanut farmer with a very colorful background and a very religious person, Jimmy Carter, James Earl Carter. And in the election of 1976, he was victorious over Ford. He won the election and became president. Just some high points of his presidency. He was really first of all, the economic problems continued, especially inflation continued. And because of this, and because of the OPEC issues, and it highlighted our dependence on foreign oil. And he was the first one to come out to say publicly, look, this is dangerous. Us being so dependent on foreign oil is a very dangerous thing, because our entire economy and our entire military runs on oil. And if we're dependent on foreign oil, then actually foreigners have control over our economy and our military. So, and he was one of the first ones to kind of push us towards alternative sources of energy, solar, electric cars, things like that. But while he was initially successful, once he left office and President Reagan became president, a more conservative attitude came about, and those things were put on the shelf, and we reverted back to our dependence on oil and focus on oil. Also, during Carter's maybe his one great success is he did finally bring Egypt and Israel to the peace tables, and brought Menachem Begin, which was the prime minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat, who was the leader of Egypt, to the table at Camp David, which is a retreat outside of Washington, D.C. And they signed a peace treaty and shook hands on national television, which was a very, very, very big deal at the time, bringing Israel and Egypt together, because they had been long-time enemies. But then probably the one negative that overshadows all of the President Carter's presidency is the Iran hostage crisis. This was really the beginning of the modern problems with the jihadists and the Muslim extremism that we have in the Middle East with the United States. This was the beginning of it, because the leader, the Shah of Iran, who was the leader of Iran, was kind of an ally of the United States. If not a puppet of the Western countries, he was at least an ally. And he was secular, meaning he wasn't very religious. I mean, he adhered to the Islamic customs, but he wasn't a fundamentalist. And he was overthrown by a bunch of fundamentalist students that were led by a cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini. And and they overran the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, which is the capital of Iran, and they held American hostages. Uh, I believe it was, I'm trying to remember exactly how many. I think, I'm drawing a blank now, I don't know why. 80 or so American hostages for 444 days. Uh, and it was humiliating. This was the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle because the news covered this all the time. And they would parade these hostages out in front of TV cameras every single day. And it was humiliating to Carter. And then to make it worse, Carter attempted a rescue of them, and it ended in disaster when a couple of helicopters crashed in the middle of the desert outside of Iran. So it wasn't until after Carter lost the election to Reagan that before Reagan took office that Iran finally released the hostages. And this is just a photo of just one example of the Iranian militants uh, parading the American hostages in front of the cameras for the world to see.